Welcome to Ars Historica. Before any image, an essential clarification. All visual content in this episode was generated by artificial intelligence. These are original conceptual recreations built from in-depth study of specialized bibliographic sources, Gombrich, Arnason, Hodge, Acidini, and others. The images do not reproduce real artworks. They are original compositions created to illustrate the concepts, techniques, and periods we will discuss. Original works belong to their museums and collections. This is an independent educational channel, and our commitment is to the accuracy of content, not the simulation of real artworks. With that said, let us begin. The image you see represents an artist at the threshold of his workshop, exactly where we are as we open this study. This conceptual recreation represents the interior of a 15th century Florentine bottega. A bottega was not simply a studio, it was simultaneously a workshop, a school, a business, and a laboratory. Notice, in this conceptual creation created for educational purposes, the elements that art historians identify as characteristic of this space. Wooden panels prepared with gesso, jars of powdered pigment on the shelves, natural window light as a central working element. It was here, in this type of space, that Renaissance artistic production organized itself, in a master-apprentice relationship that transmitted not only techniques, but a worldview. Gombrich, in The Story of Art, describes this system as the backbone of the period's visual production. The apprentice arrived at 10 or 12 years of age and spent years before touching a brush to a prepared surface. This image is a conceptual recreation of a 15th century Italian city, inspired by Florence, but not a reproduction of any existing painting or map. It is an original composition created to visually contextualize what historians describe. Florence, in the early Quattrocento, brought together exceptional conditions: the wealth of merchant families, particularly the Medici, an intellectual tradition that valued philosophy and rhetoric, and the physical legacy of classical antiquity visible in every surviving Roman column and arch. It was no accident that the Renaissance began there. It was the result of a specific set of historical, economic, and cultural conditions that history rarely repeats. Arnason describes Florence as the only place where all these conditions converged simultaneously in the 15th century. This conceptual recreation represents a Florentine baptistry architectural type, not the actual baptistry of San Giovanni, but an original composition illustrating this building type. It is in this kind of space that in 1401, the event that many historians consider the point of origin of the Renaissance occurred, the competition for the second bronze door of the Florence Baptistry. The Cloth Merchants Guild, the Arte di Calamala, launched the competition. 7 sculptors participated. The theme? The Sacrifice of Isaac. 2 finalists stood out: Filippo Brunelleschi and Lorenzo Ghiberti. Ghiberti won, and his doors, which Michelangelo would later call the Gates of Paradise, remain in the Florence Baptistry. But it was Brunelleschi's defeat that permanently changed the history of Western art. This image is a conceptual recreation illustrating the logic of Renaissance bronze relief. It does not reproduce any existing panel. What you demonstrate, based on what art history documents about these reliefs, is the fundamental principle of spatial gradation: foreground figures in high relief with full 3-dimensionality, midground figures in medium relief, and the background in almost flat bas relief. This gradation within a flat surface follows the same logic that linear perspective will apply to painting, creating the illusion of depth through a calculated system. Arnason notes that relief sculpture and perspective painting share the same fundamental problem: simulating the third dimension on a 2-dimensional surface. The artists of the 15th century were solving the same problem in different materials. This figure in the image is a conceptual recreation illustrating the architect-scholar type of the 15th century, created for educational purposes. Brunelleschi, upon returning to Florence after his competition defeat, turned to a problem that no one had yet formulated mathematically: how to represent three-dimensional space on a flat surface with verifiable precision. He carried out a precise experiment. He painted the baptistry on a small panel, pierced it at the center, and demonstrated that looking through the hole at a mirror held in front, the painting corresponded exactly to the actual building. It was the first scientific demonstration that the illusion of space could be produced mathematically, verifiable and reproducible. It was not magic, it was geometry. Leone Battista Alberti codified this method in Della Pittura in 1435. This is a conceptual recreation created specifically to visually demonstrate the logic of linear perspective. It does not reproduce any existing painting. What you see is the principle in action. All lines that are in reality parallel to the floor plane converge in pictorial representation to a single point on the horizon line, the vanishing point. The columns progressively diminish in height as they recede. The grid floor demonstrates the compression of distances. This system is not an arbitrary artistic convention. It is a consequence of the optical geometry of human vision. The light rays that reach our retina follow exactly this pattern of convergence. What Brunelleschi and Alberti discovered is that human visual perception obeys a precise mathematical structure, and that painting can be based on this structure to create a convincing illusion of depth. This conceptual recreation represents a bottega scene. It is not based on any specific painting. The figures are generic, created to illustrate the process. What it documents, based on what historiography describes, is the preparation of pigments, the first task of any Renaissance apprentice. Before touching a brush to a prepared surface, the apprentice spent years learning to transform rough stones and minerals into impalpable powder. The quality of grinding directly determined the quality of the resulting paint. Poorly ground pigments produced granular surfaces without color depth. The master only entrusted the apprentice with the preparation of precious pigments, such as lapis lazuli, after years of practice with less expensive materials. Gombrich describes this system of knowledge transmission as irreplaceable. No theoretical treatise could substitute years of supervised practice. This conceptual image was created to show the mineral pigments that formed the Renaissance painting palette. It is not a reproduction of any artwork. Each color has a distinct geopolitical and chemical history. The deep blue, ultramarine, was extracted from lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone sourced exclusively from the Sar-e-Song mines in present-day Afghanistan, and was more expensive than gold by weight. Its use signaled the patron's economic status. Vermilion was obtained from cinnabar, a natural mercury sulfide, handled with caution because of its toxicity. Yellow ochre and burnt sienna came from local iron oxide deposits. Lead white required extended exposure of metallic lead to vapors of acetic acid, essentially vinegar. Renaissance paint was chemistry before it was art. The artist also had to be an alchemist. This conceptual recreation was created specifically to demonstrate the velatura technique. It does not reproduce any existing Renaissance painting. What you observe is the principle in action. A layer of paint diluted in oil, transparent like colored glass, applied over an opaque base of cooler tone. In the transition zone, the effect becomes visible. Light penetrates the transparent layer, reaches the opaque base, and returns modified by the color filtering. The result is a luminous depth that no opaque, directly applied paint can replicate. Leonardo da Vinci, according to Vasari and other contemporary biographers, applied dozens of such layers, in some paintings working for months, sometimes years, on a single work. It is this process of accumulated velatura that explains why certain Renaissance paintings seem to emit light from within, not merely receive it from outside. This is a conceptual recreation of a Renaissance-style male portrait. It is not a portrait of any identified real person, nor a reproduction of any existing painting. It is an original composition created to demonstrate chiaroscuro as both technical principle and philosophical principle. Chiaroscuro, from the Italian chiaro, light, and scuro, dark, In the Renaissance male portrait, the almost black dark background is not a simplification, it is a deliberate philosophical choice. It eliminates any reference to external space, social context, or historical circumstance. Only the individual remains. Illuminated by a single lateral light source, the face emerges from darkness as if sculpted. Chiaroscuro transforms the two-dimensional painting into virtual sculpture. This mode of portraying the subject outside of time and space is the most direct visual statement of Renaissance humanism. The singular human being is worthy of being the sole subject of a work of art. A reminder, this conceptual recreation was created to demonstrate sfumato as a technical principle, and we make explicit that it is not a reproduction of the Mona Lisa, nor of any specific portrait by Leonardo or any other artist. It is an original composition that makes the principle visible. Sfumato, from the Italian fumo, smoke, the progressive and invisible dissolution of outlines. Notice in this image that there is no line separating the figure from the background. There is a gradation so smooth that the human eye cannot locate where the face ends and the air begins. To achieve this effect, Leonardo used brushes with very few hairs, sometimes a single strand, and worked in layers of velatura over years. Sfumato is not a technique of aesthetic softening. As Gombrich analyzes, it is a representation of the very condition of human perception. We never see with sharp edges, we see with atmosphere. This macro image was created to demonstrate the physical qualities of an aged oil painting surface. It does not reproduce any specific work. What it shows are real phenomena that conservation science and art history study systematically. Craquelure, the crack pattern that develops in the paint layer with aging, is not random damage. Its orientation, spacing, and depth reveal precise information about the techniques used, the relative thickness of layers, the drying speed, the ratio of oil to pigment. Paintings with many thin velatura layers develop an exceptionally regular craquelure. Paintings with thicker layers develop larger and more irregular cracks. Craquelure is the invisible chemical signature of the technical process and allows specialists centuries later to reconstruct the artist's methodology from the surface of the work. This conceptual recreation represents a page of anatomical study sketchbook in the Renaissance style. It does not reproduce any specific page from Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks or any other artist's work. It is an original composition created to illustrate the practice. Leonardo's notebooks are unique documents in the history of civilization, and Gombrich describes them as proof that for Leonardo, art and science were inseparable. Leonardo performed more than 30 dissections over his lifetime, and his records include original discoveries. He was the first to correctly draw the gravid uterus, to identify arteriosclerosis in an elderly man he dissected, to understand circulation as a closed system. His notebooks combine mirror writing, mechanical studies, botanical observations, and architectural plans, all integrated in an intelligence that refuses disciplinary boundaries. This conceptual image represents a Renaissance anatomical study scene without a visible cadaver, only parchment drawings. It is an original composition for educational purposes, not a reproduction of any specific scene or artwork. What it contextualizes is an act that, in the 15th century, was simultaneously scientific and subversive. Throughout the Middle Ages, human anatomy was forbidden to direct investigation. It was a matter of faith, not of observation. The authority was the 2nd century Greek physician Galen, whose texts were accepted without empirical verification. When Leonardo, Michelangelo, and later the anatomist Andreas Vesalius began dissecting bodies systematically, they were performing a radical epistemological act, placing direct observation above textual authority. That act is the methodological heart of the Renaissance and the foundation of the modern scientific method. This conceptual recreation represents a study of Renaissance-style marble sculpture in contrapposto. It is not a reproduction of Michelangelo's David or any specific sculpture. It is an original composition created to demonstrate the contrapposto principle. Contrapposto, from Italian, the opposite, the counterpoint. The posture in which the body's weight rests on one leg, producing a slight imbalance compensated by a gentle torso twist. Ancient Greeks developed this sculptural principle in the 5th century BC. The Renaissance rediscovered it and deepened it through systematic anatomical study. Contrapposto represents the opposite of the frontal rigidity of medieval sculpture, a body that seems to breathe, to have weight, to balance itself in real space. In sculpting contrapposto, the Renaissance artist was not reproducing a convention. He was affirming that the human body has its own physical intelligence that art must capture. This conceptual image was created to demonstrate non finito, literally the unfinished, as a sculptural and philosophical principle. It does not reproduce any specific sculpture by Michelangelo. It is an original composition for educational purposes. What you see is the extreme contrast between polished surface and raw stone, the hand emerging from the unfinished block. Michelangelo developed this concept over his career, and its most widespread interpretation is that the sculpture was already inside the marble. The sculptor's work was only to remove the excess. But there is a deeper philosophical reading, which Arnason and other historians explore, non finito as a representation of the permanent state of tension between matter and form, between raw potential and the realized idea. The figure trapped in the marble is not technical incompleteness, it is an affirmation that perfection exists in the idea before it exists in the stone. An important reminder, the image you see is a conceptual recreation of a chapel interior with Renaissance-style ceiling painting. It is not a reproduction of the Sistine Chapel, nor of any specific real space. It is an original composition created to contextualize the visual characteristics of fresco ceiling painting. The fresco technique, from the Italian affresco, fresh, consisted of painting on wet plaster in daily sections called giornate. Once dry, the plaster permanently fixed the pigment, but permitted no corrections. This meant the artist had to plan each section with absolute precision before beginning. What historiography documents about the Sistine ceiling, completed by Michelangelo in 1512, is that he worked practically alone for 4 years in systematic sections of fresh plaster, after dismissing his assistants for incompetence. This conceptual recreation created to demonstrate the expressiveness of hands as a narrative instrument in Renaissance painting. It does not reproduce Michelangelo's creation of Adam or any specific artwork. It is an original composition about the principle of gesture. In this image, what is being studied is the gap of space between two pairs of hands that almost touch, the gesture of giving and the gesture of receiving. In the Renaissance, hands were considered the second face of the human body, the instrument through which a character's psychology was revealed visually. Michelangelo, according to Vasari, studied hand gestures with the same meticulousness with which he studied muscles. The gap between fingers that almost touch but do not represents one of the most powerful ideas in art history, the fundamental difference between the divine and the human, between the full and that which is still in the process of receiving. This conceptual composition studies the body language of drama and anguish in the Renaissance pictorial tradition. It is not a reproduction of Michelangelo's expulsion from paradise or any specific scene. It is an original composition about the expressive principle. What the image demonstrates is how the entire body in Renaissance painting functions as an instrument of psychological expression, not only the face. The torso, the arms, the inclination of the head, the position of the feet, all participate in the narration. This capacity to narrate complex emotional states through bodily posture was one of the Renaissance's most enduring achievements, inherited directly from classical Greek sculpture, and it traversed centuries, from the Baroque to Romanticism to the language of contemporary cinema. This conceptual image represents the physical conditions of creating monumental fresco painting. It does not reproduce the Sistine Chapel or any specific space or scene. It is an original composition created to contextualize the physical effort. The scaffolding was designed by the artist himself and was an integral part of the creative process. Michelangelo, commissioned by Pope Julius II to paint the Sistine ceiling in 1508, designed scaffolding fixed to the walls, not the floor, preserving the chapel's interior space. He worked for 4 years in systematic sections of fresh plaster, practically alone after dismissing his assistants for incompetence. The result was a work that, according to Vasari, made every artist who saw it feel immediately less capable, not through intimidation, but through the sudden awareness of what is possible when technique and vision operate at their maximum. This conceptual composition represents a monumental figure in a painted architectural niche in the style of Renaissance prophets and sibyls, but without reproducing any existing figure. It is an original composition for educational purposes. What it demonstrates is the combined use of scale and bodily psychology to create monumental presence. Prophet and sibyl figures in Renaissance ceiling paintings were designed to be viewed from considerable heights, hence the exaggerated scale, amplified gestures, intensified expressions. But what Michelangelo understood, which no treatise had formulated before, is that monumental scale without psychological individuality produces only decoration. Each figure had to be an individual, not a generic type. It was a revolution in the way of conceiving large-scale figures. This conceptual recreation represents a pala d'altare, the Renaissance altar panel, as a pictorial type, not as a reproduction of any specific work. It is an original composition illustrating the conventions. The pala d'altare obeys a highly codified visual grammar. The center is always reserved for the most sacred figure. The lateral figures are in positions of deference, with bodies turned toward the center. The gold background, a direct inheritance from medieval egg tempera painting on wood, is progressively replaced in the High Renaissance by painted landscapes and architecture. But when it remains, as in the works of Giovanni Bellini, it is deliberate. It marks the sacredness of the space as something outside ordinary time. The hierarchy of composition is also a theological hierarchy. Position in the work corresponds to spiritual importance. This conceptual recreation represents the principle of figure-landscape integration through atmospheric unity. It does not reproduce any specific Madonna by Leonardo, Raphael, or any other artist. It is an original composition created to make the principle visible. Before the 15th century, figure and background were treated as completely separate visual registers in Western painting, the figure in the foreground with full volume and color, the background as a decorative pattern or neutral curtain. What Leonardo developed, and what Gombrich identifies as one of his most original contributions, was the atmospheric fusion of the two planes. The light that illuminates the figure's face is the same light that illuminates the hills in the background, only weakened by distance and mist. That continuity transforms the composition into a single breathable space, unified by atmosphere. This conceptual recreation represents the Annunciation theme as an iconographic convention. It is not a reproduction of any specific Annunciation by Leonardo, Fra Angelico, Botticelli, or any other artist. It is an original composition illustrating the conventions of the theme. What the Annunciation represents as a pictorial challenge is the question of how to represent in the same space two beings of radically different nature, the divine and the human. Renaissance solutions were various: separation by column or pilaster, difference in spatial plane, a shaft of light as mediator. What remains constant is the gestural codification: angel with raised hand in greeting, virgin with hand on chest or over the book. What distinguishes great Annunciations from mediocre ones is the psychological tension the artist places in that moment of impossible encounter between the eternal and the temporal. A reminder, this conceptual recreation studies the Last Supper composition as theme and pictorial problem. It does not reproduce Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, which is conserved in the convent of Santa Maria della Grazia in Milan. It is an original composition demonstrating the principles. The Last Supper was painted by Leonardo between 1495 and 1497 and is a simultaneous laboratory of composition, perspective, and psychology. What our conceptual composition illustrates is the fundamental principle Leonardo applied: the single vanishing point aligned with the head of the central figure so that all perspective lines guide the viewer's eye to the center before any other figure. Leonardo used geometry to make theology, linear perspective transformed into an instrument of theological hierarchy. This conceptual recreation studies hands as an instrument of visual narrative in the Renaissance tradition. It does not reproduce any specific detail from any existing work. It is an original composition about gesture at the table. What art historiography documents about Leonardo's Last Supper in particular is that each of the 12 apostles expresses a distinct psychological reaction to the revelation, and that distinction is communicated primarily through hands, not faces. Leonardo made numerous preparatory studies of isolated hands before beginning the final work. Each gesture was calculated to be immediately legible at a distance, because the fresco was positioned on the wall opposite the refectory to be viewed from afar during meals. It was a painting designed for everyday experience, not for close contemplation. This conceptual recreation represents an architectural perspective study. It does not reproduce any Renaissance ideal city painting or any existing work. It is an original composition for educational purposes. Architectural perspective in the Renaissance was not merely a pictorial technique, it was the visual expression of a new model of urban spatial organization. Leon Battista Alberti, in De Re Edificatoria, conceived the city as a rational organism, where the proportions of facades, the width of streets, and the arrangement of piazzas obeyed mathematical principles derived from the proportions of the human body. The Renaissance ideal city is a visual extension of the same thinking that produced linear perspective, the conviction that human space can and must be rationally ordered. This conceptual recreation represents a panorama of the 15th century Italian city. It does not reproduce any veduta, painted map, or existing work. It is an original composition to contextualize the Renaissance urban space. What it illustrates, based on historiographic studies, is the logic of organization of pre-modern cities, the vertical dominance of religious buildings, cathedrals, and bell towers over the urban skyline, the walled limits, the presence of a river as a structuring element. What the Renaissance will gradually propose, through the theoretical urbanism of Alberti and the practical projects in cities like Pienza, is a reorganization of this hierarchy. The public piazza begins to compete with the cathedral as the gravitational center of urban life. This conceptual recreation represents the facade of a Renaissance palazzo as an architectural type. It does not reproduce any specific existing palazzo. It is an original composition illustrating the conventions. The Florentine or Roman palazzo, according to Alberti in De Re Edificatoria, was far more than a residence. It was a public declaration of character, virtue, and social position. The rusticated stone base conveyed solidity and territorial power. The upper floors, with classically rhythmed windows, conveyed access to the culture of antiquity and intellectual refinement. Alberti stated that a building's facade was like a person's face. It had to communicate character immediately and without ambiguity. Architecture, like painting and sculpture, was a form of language that addressed the observer with a precise message. This conceptual recreation represents the interior of a Renaissance palazzo without identifiable artworks on the walls so as not to reproduce specific works. It is an original composition of space and light. The palazzo interior was a programmatically cultural space. The rooms contained paintings specifically commissioned for that environment, not museum works destined for the impartial gaze of any visitor. They were images designed to narrate the history, values, and political alliances of the family. Botticelli's works for the Medici, Mantegna's frescoes for the Gonzaga in Mantua, all depart from the same principle Gombrich identifies: art as an extension of power, as narration of legitimacy, as affirmation of collective identity. Renaissance collecting was inseparable from politics. This conceptual recreation represents the Renaissance ideal city concept. It does not reproduce any existing panel, such as those attributed to Piero della Francesca or Francesco di Giorgio. It is an original composition created to illustrate the urban concept. The Renaissance ideal city was a philosophical project before it was a building project. Filaretti, Francesco di Giorgio Martini, Leonardo, and Alberti conceived plans of geometrically perfect cities, with radial or orthogonal streets, central piazzas, buildings positioned according to principles of civic hierarchy. Almost none of these cities was built in full, although Palmanova, founded in 1593 in the Veneto, is the closest approximation. But these projects profoundly influenced European urbanism. Their echo is visible in planned capitals like Washington, Brasilia, and Canberra. This conceptual recreation represents the conventions of the Flemish double portrait of the 15th century. It does not reproduce the Arnolfini portrait by Jan van Eyck, which is in the National Gallery in London. It is an original composition created to illustrate the principles. What this composition demonstrates, based on what art historiography describes about Northern portraiture, is the level of descriptive detail that distinguished the Flemish school from the Italian. Fabrics with their individual textures, metal surfaces reflecting light, animal fur reproduced hair by hair. Jan van Eyck developed the oil painting technique on linen, which permitted this hyper-precision of detail. The convex mirror in the background, which reflects the interior with correct perspective, is one of the earliest examples of a represented space within another represented space, a pictorial mise en abîme. This conceptual recreation represents the conventions of the frontal self-portrait in the Northern European Renaissance tradition. It does not reproduce Dürer's 1500 self-portrait, which is in the Alte Pinakothek in Munich. It is an original composition created to illustrate the principle. Dürer's 1500 self-portrait is one of the most disturbing documents in art history for its iconographic audacity. Dürer represents himself frontally in a pose reserved exclusively for images of Christ in the medieval tradition, symmetrical, frontal, with the face at the center of the composition and the hand raised in a blessing gesture. The resemblance is unambiguous and intentional. What Dürer is asserting is that the artist is a creator in the image of God, that the act of artistic creation is of the same nature as the divine act of creation. It is the most radical statement of Renaissance humanism in the domain of the self-portrait. This conceptual recreation represents Renaissance allegorical painting as a type. It does not reproduce any specific existing allegory. It is an original composition created to demonstrate the iconographic system. Renaissance allegorical painting inherits and transforms the medieval tradition of personified virtues. Justice is represented as female because the Latin justitia is feminine. Wisdom carries the book because it is accumulated knowledge. The owl represents the capacity to see in darkness, a metaphor for intelligence. What the Renaissance adds to this tradition is the incorporation of classical mythology as a second symbolic lexicon. Minerva can be wisdom, Nike can be victory, Eros can be love. The two systems, Christian and pagan, coexist without perceived contradiction, in a syncretism that only Florentine Neoplatonic humanism made possible. This is a reminder. This is an original conceptual recreation inspired by the conventions of 15th century Florentine mythological painting. It does not reproduce Sandro Botticelli's Birth of Venus, which belongs to the collection of the Galleria degli Uffizi in Florence. The Birth of Venus, painted around 1483 to 1885, is the first large-format painting with an entirely secular and mythological theme produced in the West since antiquity. The commission came from the Medici, who promoted Neoplatonic philosophy. Botticelli's Venus is not erotic, she's philosophical. She represents pure beauty descending from the domain of ideas to the sensible world. The shell is the vehicle that transports her between planes. The work is a theological image with a pagan vocabulary, an equation typical of Florentine Quattrocento humanism. This conceptual recreation studies the conventions of the Renaissance garden allegory. It does not reproduce Botticelli's Primavera, which belongs to the collection of the Galleria degli Uffizi in Florence. It is an original composition created to illustrate the theme. Botticelli's Primavera, painted around 1477 to 1478, remains one of the most debated paintings in art history. There are at least 6 major academic interpretations of its meaning, without definitive consensus. What historians agree is that it represents an orange grove, the Medici symbol, inhabited by mythological figures in a process of transformation. The most accepted Neoplatonic reading interprets the work as a representation of the levels of love in a process of elevation, from sensible love to spiritual love. The movement from right to left follows the direction of Platonic elevation, from matter toward idea. This conceptual recreation represents the colorist conventions of the Venetian school. It does not reproduce any specific work by Titian, Giorgione, or any Venetian painter. It is an original composition created to demonstrate the principle. The Venetian school of the Renaissance developed an approach to painting fundamentally different from the Florentine. Where Florence privileged the segno, the line, the contour, the previously conceived structure, Venice privileged colore, the tone, the tonal value, light as constructive element. This difference is not merely technical, it reflects 2 distinct epistemological models. The Florentine departs from concept and realizes it in matter. The Venetian departs from sensible perception and reconstructs it with color. Titian brought this approach to its apex, with loose brushstrokes and rich layers that directly anticipate the technique of the 19th century Impressionists. This conceptual recreation studies the principle of the ascending diagonal as a compositional instrument. It does not reproduce Titian's Assumption of the Virgin, which remains in its original location in the Basilica dei Frari in Venice. It is an original composition created to demonstrate the principle. Titian's Assumption, completed in 1518, was the first major public work of the Venetian school to compete in monumental ambition with Michelangelo's and Raphael's Roman frescoes. What it introduced was the ascending diagonal as a compositional engine, earthly figures below in cooler tones, the central ascending figure in the middle, divine glory in warm tones above. This vertical movement creates a dynamic the viewer feels in the body. It is a painting that physically forces the eyes upward. It is composition as physical experience. This conceptual recreation represents the architectural type of a centrally planned Renaissance church. It does not reproduce Bramante's Tempietto, St. Peter's Basilica, or any specific real building. It is an original composition for educational purposes. The central plan, a building with a geometric center symmetrical in all directions, was the most persistent architectural ideal of the Renaissance because it embodied the Neoplatonic model of formal perfection. Donato Bramante, the architect who most radically explored this ideal, designed the Tempietto in Rome in 1502, a small rotunda of absolute compositional perfection, considered by many critics to be the most perfect building of the Renaissance. When Bramante designed the reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica for Pope Julius II, the original plan was a pure central type. The subsequent modifications were perceived by contemporaries as a betrayal of the ideal. This conceptual recreation represents a gathering of philosophical figures in a grand environment. It does not reproduce Raphael Sanzio's School of Athens, which is part of the frescoes in the Stanze della Segnatura at the Vatican. It is an original composition created to demonstrate the compositional principles. The School of Athens, painted between 1509 and 1511, is perhaps the most complete statement of the Renaissance humanist ideal. In a single architectural space, Raphael gathered the greatest philosophers and mathematicians of antiquity. Plato and Aristotle at the center, one pointing to the sky, the other to the ground, define the two poles of Western thought, Platonic idealism and Aristotelian empiricism. Our conceptual composition studies how linear perspective, variety of poses and expressions, and organization into related groups create complex order without apparent violence, what critics called facilitas. This conceptual recreation studies a group of figures in philosophical debate. It does not reproduce any specific detail from Raphael's stanze. It is an original composition about facilitas. Facilitas, the art of concealing effort, of making the complex appear natural, is, according to Baldassare Castiglione in the Book of the Courtier, the supreme ideal of the Renaissance man in any domain of excellence. Raphael is the painter who most completely realized this ideal. 50 figures with distinct poses, gestures, and expressions, organized in coherent reciprocal relationships in a mathematically correct perspective, and the result appears spontaneous. For Gombrich, this is the greatest proof of talent, when the work is invisible enough to seem not to exist. This conceptual recreation represents a humanist in his Renaissance workspace. It is not a portrait of any identified real person, nor a reproduction of any specific painting. It is an original composition to illustrate the humanist type. The humanist in his study, with scientific instruments, books, maps, a globe, is the visual symbol of the new intellectual model that the Renaissance built. This scholar is not withdrawn from the world. He's using knowledge to understand it. His figure is the direct precursor of the natural scientist of the 17th century, the encyclopedist philosopher of the 18th century, the public intellectual of the 19th century. Renaissance humanism, as Gombrich analyzes, was not merely an artistic movement, it was the foundation of a way of being in the world that still organizes the institutions of Western knowledge. This conceptual recreation represents the expressive style of 16th-century Northern European religious painting. It does not reproduce any specific work by Dürer, Grunewald, or any Northern artist. It is an original composition illustrating the characteristics. The German Renaissance developed an intense dialogue with the Protestant Reformation, initiated by Martin Luther in 1517. For Luther, religious images were instruments of idolatry. Faith was to be transmitted through the written word. This position generated iconoclasm in Protestant territories, works destroyed, frescoes covered in lime, but it also paradoxically strengthened secular painting, portraits, landscapes, everyday scenes. The religious crisis, by removing the monopoly of religious commission, opened space for new subjects and new patrons. Northern art found in the Reformation not an end, but a redirection. This conceptual recreation represents Mannerism as a visual language. It does not reproduce any specific work by Pontormo, Rosso Fiorentino, Parmigianino, or any Mannerist artist. It is an original composition to demonstrate the style's characteristics. Mannerism emerges in the 1520s as a response to a generation of artists to a specific problem. When Raphael, Michelangelo, and Leonardo had already accomplished everything the Renaissance language could accomplish, what was there still to do? Mannerism responded with a deliberate inversion of principles. Where the Renaissance sought balance and naturalness, Mannerism sought tension and sophisticated artificiality. Where the Renaissance used chromatic harmonies, Mannerism used acid and dissonant combinations. The elongated figures you see, anatomically impossible, affirm art does not need to obey nature. This conceptual recreation represents the conventions of Venetian grand banquet painting. It does not reproduce any specific work by Paolo Veronese, including the wedding at Cana or the feast in the house of Levi. It is an original composition created to illustrate the style. Paolo Veronese represents the opposite pole from Mannerism. Where Mannerism is introspective and anguished, Veronese is theatrical, celebratory, and extroverted. His banquet compositions were visual operas, where religiosity was a pretext for representing the grandeur of Venetian civilization. Veronese was summoned by the Inquisition in 1573 to explain the presence of dogs, dwarves, and German soldiers in a Last Supper painting. His response was to change the title to Feast in the House of Levi, keeping the work intact. It is one of the first documented acts of assertion of artistic creative freedom against religious authority. This conceptual recreation represents the interior of a Renaissance collector's cabinet, without identifiable artworks visible so as not to reproduce specific works. It is an original composition to contextualize the collecting phenomenon. The rise of private art collecting in the Renaissance is inseparable from the formation of a new art market. Before the 14th century, artworks were almost entirely commissioned by institutions for specific purposes. With the Renaissance, a new type of relationship with the artwork emerged. It begins to have value in itself, by the artist's name, by the quality of execution. This is the moment when the modern concept of artwork as an object of autonomous value is born, disconnected from any specific liturgical or narrative function, and with it, the art market as an economic institution. This conceptual recreation represents the architectural type of the domed basilica with colonnade. It does not reproduce St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican or any specific real building. It is an original composition to illustrate the theme. St. Peter's Basilica is the monument that synthesizes and closes the cycle of the Roman Renaissance, while simultaneously inaugurating the Baroque. Bramante's original project of 1505 was a pure central plan. After his death in 1514, Raphael, Antonio da Sangallo the Younger, Michelangelo, who partially returned to the central ideal in the dome's design, and finally Gian Lorenzo Bernini, who in the 17th century added the piazza colonnade, all worked on the project. St. Peter's is not a building of one period. It is a palimpsest of generations of architects in dialogue with the same project. It is the Renaissance's conversation with the Baroque. This conceptual recreation represents a Renaissance artist's sketchbook page. It does not reproduce any specific page from Leonardo's, Michelangelo's, Raphael's, or any other artist's notebooks. It is an original composition for educational purposes. A Renaissance artist's sketchbook is a process document, thought in motion before it fixes itself in the definitive work. Unlike finished works, sketchbooks reveal errors, attempts, variations explored and abandoned. They are a window into creative intelligence before any final decision. They also reveal the profoundly integrated nature of Renaissance thinking. On the same page, side by side, an anatomical study and an architectural project, a religious composition and hydraulic mechanics calculations. The Renaissance artist did not compartmentalize knowledge. He saw it, at the core of humanism, as a unity. We close this episode with a concluding image, a studio at dusk, empty, without identifiable artworks, an original composition created specifically for this moment. A reminder, everything you saw in this episode were conceptual recreations generated by artificial intelligence, based on the study of Gombrich, Arnason, Hodge, Acidini, and others. The original works that inspired these concepts belong to their museums, the Uffizi, the Vatican, the Galleria dell'Accademia, the Louvre, the Prado. The Renaissance bequeathed to the Western world a stance before knowledge that goes far beyond the works it produced, the conviction that the human being can and must observe the world with rigor, represent it with honesty, and transform it with intelligence. In our next episode, we will follow what happened when that certainty began to fracture, and 19th century artists decided to leave their studios and confront the light of day. Thank you for watching Ars Historica.